The gold ring slipped from Penelope Anderson's trembling fingers into the pawnbroker's weathered palm, and she watched her last connection to her mother disappear behind the counter for $35 that would barely get her west of Kansas. The small band, with its delicate filigree work, had been the only thing of value she owned after the bank foreclosed on their Boston boarding house, after the fever took her mother, after everything that mattered crumbled like dried leaves in her hands. Now, in the spring of 1878, she stood in a dusty Philadelphia pawn shop trading memories for a future she could barely imagine, clutching a tattered newspaper advertisement promising teaching positions in the mining towns of California, where women were scarce and opportunities supposedly abundant. The stagecoach journey tested every ounce of courage Penelope possessed. 3 weeks of jarring roads, terrible food, and the constant fear that her money would run out before she reached Bodie, California, left her exhausted and hollow. She was 22 years old, alone in the world, and betting everything on a town she had never seen. The other passengers changed at every stop, their faces blurring together until she reached Sacramento, where she boarded the final stage that would take her through the Sierra Nevada mountains to the high desert country where Bodie waited. The town materialized from the barren landscape like a fever dream. Wooden buildings lined a main street thick with dust, and the constant thunder of stamp mills crushing ore echoed through the valley. Men outnumbered women 20-1, their eyes following her as she stepped from the stage with her single carpetbag and the address of the boarding house where she had arranged lodging. The air tasted different here, thin and sharp, nothing like the humid Boston springs she had known. Everything felt raw and unfinished, as though the town itself was still deciding whether to thrive or blow away with the next wind. The boarding house keeper, a stout widow named Mrs. Chen, whose husband had died in a mining accident, showed Penelope to a narrow room with a window overlooking the street. The teaching position was real, Mrs. Chen confirmed, but the school board wanted to meet her before making any final decisions. They were particular about moral character, she warned, and Penelope better present herself properly if she wanted the job. 2 days later, Penelope stood before 3 stern-faced men in the assay office that doubled as the town hall, answering questions about her education and her religious convictions. They hired her on the spot, desperate for anyone with a genuine teaching certificate from a proper Eastern school. The salary was $40 a month, more than she had ever earned in Boston. She would start the following Monday with 19 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old, children of miners and merchants and the few successful prospectors who had struck rich veins in the surrounding hills. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden structure with rough benches and a pot-bellied stove that barely heated the single room. Penelope threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction from her loneliness. She taught reading and arithmetic, geography and history, trying to instill some culture and learning into children who had seen more hardship than most adults back east. Some days the stamp mills were so loud she had to shout to be heard. Other days, dust storms turned the air brown and gritty, seeping through every crack in the walls. 3 weeks into her tenure, a rancher named Isaac Porter rode into town with a problem. He had found something in the street outside the general store, and the storekeeper had directed him to the new school teacher. Isaac was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work, with dark hair that curled at his collar and gray eyes that held both kindness and wariness in equal measure. He raised cattle on a spread 15 miles north of town, one of the few ranchers who had managed to make a living in the high desert, despite the miners' constant encroachment on grazing land. Penelope was dismissing her students for the day when Isaac knocked on the schoolhouse door. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, turning the dust motes golden. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in the confined space as though he belonged to wide open country and empty horizons. "Miss Anderson." His voice was deeper than she expected, roughened by wind and weather. "I apologize for the interruption, but Mr. Wilson at the store said you might be able to help me with something." "Of course. What can I do for you, Mr. Porter?" "Isaac Porter." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "I found this in the street about a month back. Been trying to figure out who it belongs to. Wilson said you came to town around that time, and since it is clearly a lady's ring, well." He unfolded the handkerchief, and Penelope's heart stopped. The gold ring caught the light, its delicate filigree work as familiar as her own hand. She had looked at that ring every day of her childhood, watching it gleam on her mother's finger as she worked and cooked and managed their boarding house. The small ruby at its center was no bigger than a grain of rice, but to Penelope it had always seemed the most precious jewel in the world. "Where did you find this?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Isaac's expression shifted, reading the emotion in her face. "In the street, like I said, right outside the general store. It was just lying there in the dirt. I figured whoever lost it would be heartbroken, so I have been asking around, but nobody claimed it." Penelope reached out with shaking fingers, then pulled back. "I pawned that ring in Philadelphia to buy my ticket west. How did it end up here? You are certain it is yours?" "It was my mother's." "See that mark on the inside of the band? That is where my father scratched their initials when they married. E and M for Elizabeth and Michael. She died last winter, and I had nothing else of value to sell." Isaac studied her face for a long moment, then placed the ring gently in her palm. His fingers were calloused and warm, and the brief contact sent an unexpected shock through her. "Then it belongs with you. I am glad I found its rightful owner. But I sold it. Someone paid money for it. And somehow it traveled all the way out here and landed in my path. Seems to me that is fate telling us something." He smiled for the first time, and it transformed his weathered face. "I am just the messenger. I cannot simply take it. You could have sold it yourself. That gold alone is worth something." "Miss Anderson, I have a ranch and 300 head of cattle. I do not need to sell a lady's ring, but you need to have your mother's ring back. That is more important than money." Tears blurred her vision as she slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just as it always had when she tried it on as a child. "I do not know how to thank you. This means more to me than I can say." "No thanks necessary, just doing what is right." Isaac shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion. "I should let you get back to your work." "Wait." Penelope wiped her eyes, suddenly desperate not to let him leave. "How did it get here? I pawned it to a broker in Philadelphia. Did you buy it from someone?" "That is the strange part. It was just lying in the street. Maybe fell out of someone's pocket, maybe dropped by accident. The stagecoach stops right there at the store. Could have fallen from a passenger's baggage. But what are the chances? Of all the people in this town, you found it and brought it to me. Like I said, fate." Isaac settled his hat back on his head. "I am glad I could return it to you, Miss Anderson. You take care now." She watched him walk to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood patiently at the hitching rail. He mounted with easy grace and tipped his hat to her before riding north out of town. Penelope stood in the schoolhouse doorway until he disappeared into the dust and distance, the ring warm and solid on her finger, her heart beating with something she had not felt in months. Not quite hope, not quite excitement, but something close to both. The next few weeks passed in a blur of teaching and settling into Bodie's rough rhythms. Penelope learned to navigate the crowded streets, to ignore the occasional drunk stumbling from a saloon, to appreciate the stark beauty of the high desert landscape. The ring stayed on her finger, a constant reminder of her mother and the strange providence that had returned it to her. She found herself thinking about Isaac Porter more often than she wanted to admit, wondering about his ranch and his life, curious about the man who had gone to such trouble to return something that did not belong to him. She saw him twice in town over the following month, once at the general store and once outside the assay office. Both times he tipped his hat politely and asked how she was settling in. Both times their conversations were brief and proper, nothing inappropriate for a respectable schoolteacher and a bachelor rancher. But Penelope noticed the way his eyes lingered on her face, the slight hesitation before he said goodbye, the sense that he wanted to say more but could not find the words. Summer arrived with brutal heat that baked the streets and turned the surrounding hills brown and sere. Penelope's students grew restless and distracted, dreaming of swimming holes and freedom. She did her best to keep them engaged, but by late June she was as eager for the summer break as they were. On the last day of the school term, Isaac appeared at the schoolhouse again. This time he brought a basket covered with a clean cloth. Penelope was sweeping the floor, preparing to close up for the summer when she heard his knock. "Mr. Porter, this is a surprise." He looked even more uncomfortable than the first time, shifting the basket from one hand to the other. "Miss Anderson, I hope I am not intruding. I wanted to congratulate you on completing your first term here. Folks in town say you have done a fine job with the children." "That is very kind. Please come in." He stepped inside and the schoolhouse felt suddenly smaller. "I brought you something." "Nothing fancy, just some things from the ranch. Mrs. Patterson, my housekeeper, insisted I put together a proper basket." Penelope took the basket and set it on her desk. Inside she found fresh bread, butter wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves, and a small container of honey. "This is too generous. We have more than we need. Mrs. Patterson likes to feed people. It is her primary occupation besides keeping the house." Isaac smiled again, that rare expression that made him look younger and less careworn. "She would be offended if you refused." "Then please thank her for me. This is wonderful." An awkward silence fell between them. Penelope searched for something to say, some way to extend the conversation. Isaac cleared his throat and turned his hat in his hands, clearly wrestling with something. "Miss Anderson, I was wondering if you might like to see the ranch sometime. Mrs. Patterson would be there, of course, as a proper chaperone. I thought you might enjoy seeing a bit more of the country around here. It is different from town, quieter. The mountains are beautiful this time of year if you get up high enough." Penelope's heart jumped. "I would like that very much. Sunday, perhaps, I could pick you up after church services. We would be back before dark." Sunday would be perfect. The relief on his face was unmistakable. "Good, that is good. I will come by Mrs. Chen's place around noon then." After he left, Penelope sat at her desk and stared at the basket, her mind racing. This was more than a simple gesture of appreciation. Isaac Porter was courting her in his careful, hesitant way. The realization filled her with equal parts excitement and terror. She barely knew him, yet she felt drawn to his quiet strength and his fundamental decency. He had returned her mother's ring when he could have kept it or sold it. That spoke to his character more clearly than any words could. Sunday arrived bright and cloudless. Penelope dressed in her best summer dress, a blue cotton with white trim that she had made over from one of her mother's old gowns. She told herself not to be nervous, that this was simply a friendly visit, nothing more. Mrs. Chen gave her a knowing look as she headed out to meet Isaac, but said nothing beyond a reminder to be back by supper. Isaac drove a sturdy wagon drawn by 2 horses. He had cleaned up, shaved carefully, and wore a pressed shirt that looked stiff with newness. The awkwardness between them lasted only until they left town. As the wagon rolled north through the sagebrush and scattered junipers, Isaac began to talk about the land and his work, and Penelope found herself relaxing into the conversation. He had come west from Missouri 5 years earlier, he told her, after working as a ranch hand for his uncle. He had saved enough money to buy a section of land and a small herd of cattle, building his business slowly through hard work and careful management. The ranch was his entire life, his dream made solid and real. "It is not easy country," he admitted. "The winters are harsh and the summers are dry, but there is something about this land that gets into your blood. The space, the silence, the way you can see for miles in every direction. Back in Missouri, I always felt crowded, hemmed in. Here I can breathe." Penelope understood exactly what he meant. Despite her loneliness, despite the strangeness of Bodie, she felt a similar sense of liberation. "I felt that way in Boston. Everything was so prescribed, so proper. There were rules for every little thing. Out here, it is like the world is still being invented." "That is exactly it." Isaac glanced at her, his gray eyes warm. "Most folks do not understand that. They just see hardship and dirt and work." The ranch house sat in a shallow valley with a creek running through the property. It was a simple structure, well built with a covered porch and a stone chimney. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the surrounding area, and cattle grazed on the hillsides beyond. Mrs. Patterson, a cheerful woman in her 50s, greeted them with enthusiasm, and immediately swept Penelope into the house to show off her kitchen and the parlor with its precious glass windows. They ate dinner at the scrubbed pine table while Mrs. Patterson chattered about ranch life and peppered Penelope with questions about Boston. After the meal, Isaac offered to show her around the property. They walked along the creek, the water shallow but clear, and he pointed out landmarks and explained his plans for expanding the herd and improving the grazing land. "Why teaching?" he asked as they paused in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Why come all the way out here alone?" Penelope touched the ring on her finger, a habit she had developed over the past weeks. "I had nothing left in Boston. My father died when I was young, and my mother and I ran a boarding house together. When she got sick, I spent everything we had on doctors and medicine. It was not enough. After she died, the bank took the house for unpaid debts. Teaching was the only skill I had, and Boston was full of teachers. The advertisement for Bodie promised good pay and a fresh start. So I pawned the ring and bought a ticket west. That took courage. It took desperation." She smiled sadly. "Courage would have been staying and fighting. I ran away. You took a chance on something better. That is not running away." They stood close enough that Penelope could see the fine lines around his eyes, the sun-weathered quality of his skin. "Why did you really search so hard for the ring's owner?" she asked. "You could have given it to any woman and claimed it was hers." Isaac was quiet for a moment, watching the water ripple over the rocks. "My mother died when I was 12. She had a locket that was her most precious possession. After she passed, my father sold everything she owned to pay for her funeral and our passage west. I never saw that locket again. I know what it feels like to lose the last piece of someone you loved. I could not do that to another person." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. They stood like that for a long moment, holding hands in the dappled shade while the creek sang over the stones and the cattle lowed in the distance. "I am glad you found the ring," she said quietly. "I am glad you found me. So am I." The summer days stretched long and golden, and Isaac came to town every Sunday to take Penelope driving. Sometimes they went back to the ranch, where Mrs. Patterson fed them and gave them privacy to walk and talk. Other times they explored the mountains, following rough trails to high meadows where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and the air smelled of pine and sunshine. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their histories and their dreams, learning each other's stories. Isaac told her about growing up in Missouri, about working cattle drives as a teenager, about the back-breaking labor of building his ranch from nothing. Penelope told him about her childhood in Boston, about helping her mother run the boarding house, about the fear and grief of watching her mother die slowly. They were both orphans, both survivors, both trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their pasts. The attraction between them grew from friendship into something deeper. Penelope found herself thinking about Isaac constantly, counting the days until Sunday, memorizing the way he smiled and the sound of his laugh. Isaac grew bolder in his affections, holding her hand openly, sitting close beside her in the wagon, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In early August, they drove up to a high meadow where the view stretched for miles across the desert valleys and distant mountains. Isaac had packed a picnic, and they spread a blanket in the shade of a massive boulder. After they ate, he pulled her close and kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and tentative, a question more than a statement, and Penelope answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with all the longing she had been holding inside. "I love you," Isaac said when they finally broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. "I know it is fast, but I cannot help it. I love you, Penelope. I love you too." The words came easily, naturally, because they were true. She had fallen in love with this quiet, decent man who had returned her mother's ring and shown her what kindness looked like. "I think I started loving you the day you brought the ring to the schoolhouse. Marry me." His hands cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "I know you have only been here a few months. I know I am just a rancher with a hard life to offer. But I will love you for the rest of my days, and I will work myself to the bone to make you happy. Say yes." "Yes." Penelope laughed through her tears. "Yes, Isaac, I will marry you." They set the wedding for late September, after the worst of the summer heat had passed, but before winter arrived with its bitter cold. Penelope continued teaching through the fall term while Isaac worked to prepare the ranch house for a wife. He added a room for her personal use, a place where she could read and sew and have privacy. He bought furniture from Sacramento, new curtains and dishes and linens, everything he thought she might need or want. Mrs. Chen helped Penelope sew a wedding dress from cream-colored silk that Isaac ordered specially from San Francisco. The other women in town contributed their own touches, lending lace and pearls, offering advice and encouragement. Despite the rough nature of Bodie, the community embraced Penelope and celebrated her upcoming marriage with genuine warmth. The ceremony took place in the small church on a Saturday afternoon, with half the town crowding into the pews to witness the vows. Penelope wore her mother's ring on her right hand, saving her left for the simple gold band. Isaac slipped on her finger when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. When Isaac kissed her, the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. The reception was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in the street and food contributed by dozens of families. There was music and dancing, speeches and toasts, the whole town turning out to celebrate. Penelope danced with Isaac until her feet ached, laughing at his professed clumsiness, though he moved with surprising grace. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, she looked around at the smiling faces and felt a rush of gratitude for this strange, rough town that had become her home. Isaac drove them back to the ranch under a sky ablaze with stars. Mrs. Patterson had tactfully agreed to spend the weekend with her sister in town, leaving them alone in the house. Isaac carried Penelope over the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture, and set her down gently in the parlor. "Welcome home, Mrs. Porter." Penelope wound her arms around his neck and kissed him deeply. "Take me to bed, husband." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a fumbling and beautiful exploration of each other. Isaac was patient and careful, making sure Penelope felt loved and cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, whispering and laughing, making plans for their future. Life on the ranch was harder than Penelope had imagined, but also more rewarding. She rose before dawn to cook breakfast for Isaac and the 2 ranch hands he employed. She learned to milk the cow, tend the chickens, preserve food for winter, and manage the 100 tasks that kept a household running. The work was endless, but it was purposeful in a way her life in Boston had never been. She continued teaching through the school year, driving into town 3 times a week while Isaac managed the ranch. He worried about her making the journey alone, but Penelope insisted on maintaining her independence. Teaching gave her a sense of identity beyond being a rancher's wife, and the income helped with expenses. Besides, she loved working with the children and watching them grow and learn. Isaac proved to be everything Penelope had hoped for in a husband. He was gentle and considerate, always thinking of her comfort and happiness. He consulted her on ranch decisions, valuing her opinions and ideas. He told her he loved her every single day, and showed it through countless small actions. When winter arrived and snow buried the high country, he kept the house warm and cozy, reading aloud to her in the evenings while she sewed or knitted. Their first argument came in late January when Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She wanted to continue teaching through the spring term, but Isaac insisted she stop immediately. The fight was short but intense, both of them stubborn and convinced they were right. "I am not made of glass," Penelope said, her voice sharp with frustration. "Women have been having babies and working for thousands of years. Not my wife, not carrying my child." Isaac's jaw was set, his eyes worried rather than angry. "The roads are terrible in winter. What if the wagon tips? What if you get caught in a storm? What if the sky falls? Isaac, I will go mad sitting here doing nothing for months." "You would not be doing nothing. There is plenty to do around the house." "That is not the same, and you know it." They stood glaring at each other across the kitchen table until Isaac's expression softened. He came around and pulled her into his arms. "I am scared," he admitted quietly. "My mother died in childbirth with my younger sister. I know it is not rational, but the thought of anything happening to you terrifies me." Penelope's anger dissolved. She had not known that detail about his mother. "Nothing is going to happen to me. I am healthy and strong, please, for me. Just stop teaching until after the baby comes." "You can go back next fall if you want," she agreed, though it chafed to give up her classroom. The pregnancy was easy at first, but by March she was exhausted and uncomfortable, her body changing in ways that both amazed and frustrated her. Isaac treated her like precious china, hovering and worrying until she wanted to scream. Mrs. Patterson returned to help around the house, which eased some of the burden but also made Penelope feel useless. The baby came in late May during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and turned the world gray with rain. The labor was long and difficult, hours of pain that left Penelope sobbing and exhausted. Isaac stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead, his face gray with fear. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy boy with strong lungs and a head of dark hair, Isaac wept with relief. They named him Michael, after Penelope's father. He was perfect and beautiful and demanding, crying at all hours and needing constant attention. Penelope was overwhelmed by the intensity of her love for this tiny person, by the fierce protectiveness that surged through her every time she held him. Isaac was equally smitten, spending hours just watching the baby sleep, marveling at his miniature fingers and toes. The first year of Michael's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Penelope did not return to teaching that fall, too exhausted and consumed by motherhood to consider it. Isaac hired another hand to help with the ranch work, freeing him to spend more time with his family. They settled into new rhythms, learning to be parents together, making mistakes and finding their way. When Michael was 15 months old, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news brought joy rather than worry. They had survived the first baby, learned how to manage parenthood, and felt ready for another child. The pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring of 1881, Penelope gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after her mother. Elizabeth was calmer than her brother, a placid baby who slept through the night early and smiled readily. Michael, now a toddling 2-year-old, was fascinated by his sister, wanting to touch her constantly and bring her his toys. The house felt full and alive with children, exactly what Penelope had always dreamed of. As the children grew, the ranch prospered. Isaac expanded his herd and bought additional land, building his reputation as a reliable supplier of quality beef. Penelope managed the household with increasing skill, mastering the art of preserving and preparing food, sewing clothes for the family, and creating a warm and welcoming home. She occasionally thought about returning to teaching, but the work of raising children and managing the ranch left little time for other pursuits. The years rolled past, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Michael grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere. Elizabeth was clever and spirited, learning to read at 4 and constantly asking questions about everything. Isaac added a third child to the family in 1883, another boy they named James. The house rang with laughter and tears, arguments and reconciliations, all the noise and chaos of a growing family. Penelope often thought about the strange providence that had brought her to Bodie and to Isaac. If she had not pawned her mother's ring, she would not have had the money to travel west. If Isaac had not found the ring in the street, they might never have met. The coincidence seemed too perfect to be mere chance, as though some greater force had arranged their meeting. She kept the ring in a special box on her dresser, taking it out occasionally to remember her mother and the journey that had brought her here. It was no longer just a symbol of loss, but also of hope and new beginnings. Someday, she thought, she would give it to Elizabeth, passing down not just the jewelry but the story of how it had been lost and found, how it had brought her parents together. Isaac often expressed similar thoughts, marveling at the unlikely chain of events that had led to their happiness. "What are the chances?" he would say, shaking his head. "Of all the people who could have found that ring, of all the places it could have ended up, somehow it led me to you." "Fate," Penelope would reply, echoing his words from that first meeting. "You said it yourself that day in the schoolhouse. Fate brought us together." By 1885, Bodie had begun to decline. The richest ore deposits were playing out, and miners were leaving for new strikes in other territories. The population dropped from its peak of nearly 10,000 to less than 3,000. The school where Penelope had taught closed for lack of students, the building eventually repurposed as a warehouse. Many of the businesses shuttered, their owners moving on to chase new opportunities. Isaac's ranch remained stable, relatively isolated from the boom and bust cycle of the mining economy. He sold cattle to the remaining miners and shipped beef to Sacramento and San Francisco, adapting to the changing market. The family was comfortable if not wealthy, their life marked by hard work and simple pleasures. In the summer of 1886, Penelope's fourth child arrived, a daughter they named Sarah. At 30 years old, Penelope felt both more confident and more exhausted than with her previous pregnancies. Sarah was a difficult baby, colicky and fussy, testing everyone's patience. But she was also their last child, and both Isaac and Penelope savored the experience, knowing these would be their final months with an infant. The children grew and changed, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Michael announced at age 10 that he wanted to be a rancher like his father. Elizabeth declared she would be a teacher like her mother had been. James wanted to be a train engineer, fascinated by the locomotives that passed through the region. Sarah, still a toddler, was too young to know what she wanted beyond her mother's attention. Isaac and Penelope watched their children grow with pride and occasional anxiety. The world was changing rapidly, new technologies and ideas filtering even into isolated places like Bodie. They wanted their children to have opportunities, to be educated and prepared for whatever future awaited them. In 1888, Isaac sold a large portion of his cattle herd for an excellent price and used the money to make improvements to the ranch. He drilled a well closer to the house, eliminating the daily trek to the creek for water. He built a larger barn and expanded the corrals. He even bought a new piano that was hauled up from Sacramento, a gift for Penelope, who had mentioned once that she missed the music lessons of her childhood. Penelope cried when the piano arrived, overwhelmed by Isaac's thoughtfulness. She had not played in years, but her fingers remembered the old melodies. Soon the house filled with music in the evenings. The children gathered around to sing while Penelope played hymns and folk songs. These were the happiest years of Penelope's life. The hard early days of their marriage had mellowed into comfortable companionship. She and Isaac knew each other deeply, had weathered difficulties together, and emerged stronger. They still loved each other with the same intensity as their courtship, but now that love was layered with years of shared experiences and mutual respect. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Isaac took Penelope back to the high meadow where he had proposed. The children stayed with Mrs. Patterson, who was now in her 60s but still spry and energetic. Isaac and Penelope spent the day alone, talking and laughing, remembering their early courtship and everything that had happened since. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked as they lay on a blanket watching clouds drift across the brilliant blue sky. "Leaving Boston, coming out here, marrying a rancher?" "Never." Penelope laced her fingers through his. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be, with you, with our children. This is home. I wake up some mornings and cannot believe you are real, that you chose me." "I could say the same thing. You are the best man I have ever known, Isaac Porter." He rolled toward her and kissed her thoroughly, his hand cupping her face. "I love you more now than the day we married." "I did not think that was possible, but it is true. I love you too. Always." They made love in the meadow, hidden by tall grass and surrounded by wildflowers, as passionate and connected as they had been on their wedding night. Afterward, they dozed in the sunshine, wrapped in each other's arms, content in a way that required no words. As the 1890s approached, Bodie continued its slow decline. The population stabilized around 1,500, a mix of stubborn miners still working marginal claims, business owners serving the remaining residents, and ranchers like Isaac, who had built sustainable operations independent of mining. The wild, rough character of the early boom years had faded, replaced by a more settled community feeling. Michael, now 15, worked alongside his father full-time on the ranch. He had grown tall and strong, with Isaac's work ethic and Penelope's thoughtful nature. Elizabeth, 13, helped her mother with the younger children and the household chores while pursuing her own education through books ordered from San Francisco. James, 10, was all energy and mischief, constantly building things or taking them apart to see how they worked. Sarah, at 7, was her father's shadow, following him around the ranch and begging to help with every task. Penelope was 41 years old, her dark hair now threaded with silver, her face lined from years of sun and wind and laughter. She felt the weight of her years more than she once had, the daily tasks requiring more effort than before. But she was happy in a deep, abiding way that had nothing to do with youth or beauty, and everything to do with a life well lived. Isaac, at 45, was still strong and vital, though his hair had gone mostly gray and his face bore the marks of decades of outdoor work. He moved a bit slower than in his youth, but he could still work a full day and then play with his children in the evening. He had built a good life through sheer determination and honest labor, and he was proud of what he had accomplished. In the spring of 1893, Elizabeth announced she wanted to attend a teacher's college in Sacramento. She had saved money from selling eggs and doing sewing work for other families, and she had secured a partial scholarship through correspondence with the school. She would need to leave home for 3 years, living in a dormitory and studying full-time. Penelope's first instinct was to say no, to keep her daughter close and safe. But she remembered her own longing for independence, her desperate need to make her own way. She and Isaac discussed it for weeks before finally agreeing to let Elizabeth go. It was terrifying to send their daughter into the world, but it was also necessary. Elizabeth had dreams of her own, and they would not stand in her way. When Elizabeth left that fall, the house felt emptier despite the presence of 3 other children. Penelope cried for days, missing her daughter with a physical ache. Isaac comforted her as best he could, reminding her that this was what good parents did. They raised children who were strong enough to leave. Letters arrived regularly from Sacramento, full of Elizabeth's excitement about her studies and her new experiences. She was thriving, making friends and excelling in her classes. Penelope was proud even as she missed her daughter terribly. The pattern repeated over the following years as each child reached maturity and began their own journey. Michael took over more of the ranch operations, eventually building his own small house on the property and bringing home a wife, a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread. James left for San Francisco to study engineering, fulfilling his childhood dream. Sarah, the youngest, stayed home the longest, helping her mother and caring for the ranch until she married a merchant from Bodie and moved into town. By 1900, Isaac and Penelope found themselves alone again in the ranch house. They were 54 and 49 years old, no longer young but not yet old, facing the next chapter of their lives with a mixture of relief and melancholy. The house that had once rung with children's voices was quiet now, the rooms feeling too large and too empty, but they still had each other. They fell back into the rhythms of their early marriage, taking long walks together, sitting on the porch in the evenings and watching the stars emerge. Their love had deepened and matured over the years, becoming something richer and more complex than the passion of youth. They knew each other completely, could communicate with a glance or a touch, were comfortable in silences that needed no filling. Isaac began talking about selling part of the ranch to Michael, gradually reducing his own workload. Penelope spent more time on hobbies she had neglected during the busy years of child rearing, reading extensively and returning to her piano with renewed dedication. They traveled occasionally, visiting their children and seeing parts of the country they had never explored. In the summer of 1902, all 4 children and their families gathered at the ranch for a celebration of Isaac and Penelope's 25th wedding anniversary. The house overflowed with grandchildren, 7 in total, ranging from infants to pre-teens. The noise and chaos were both exhausting and joyful, a reminder of what their lives had been and what they had created together. At the anniversary dinner, with everyone gathered around the expanded table, Penelope told the story of her mother's ring. The grandchildren listened wide-eyed as she described pawning it in Philadelphia, traveling west alone, and the miraculous moment when Isaac appeared at the schoolhouse to return it. She showed them the ring, passing it around so each child could examine the delicate filigree and the tiny ruby. "Your grandfather is a hero," she said, her eyes finding Isaac's across the table. "He did not have to search for the ring's owner. He did not have to care. But he did, because that is the kind of man he is. And because of his kindness, because of that one good deed, we found each other. All of you exist because your grandfather returned a lost ring to a lonely teacher." Isaac's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Best thing I ever did, finding that ring. It led me to your grandmother, and she gave me everything that matters in this life." The grandchildren applauded, not fully understanding the depth of emotion in the room, but responding to the obvious love between their grandparents. Elizabeth, now a teacher herself and mother of 3, wiped her own tears and squeezed her mother's hand. After dinner, as the sun set and the adults lingered over coffee while the children played in the yard, Isaac took Penelope's hand and led her out to the porch. They sat in the old rocking chairs he had built years ago, moving in gentle synchronization as they had done thousands of times before. "No regrets?" Isaac asked, echoing his question from years earlier. "Not a single one. Only that I did not find you sooner. I wish we had more time." "We have all the time we need. This life, this love, it is enough. More than enough. It is everything." Isaac raised her hand to his lips and kissed the ring on her finger, the same gold band that had brought them together so many years ago. "To another 25 years and beyond. To forever," Penelope agreed. They sat together in the gathering darkness, holding hands and watching the stars appear one by one over the mountains. The house behind them glowed with lamplight and echoed with the voices of their children and grandchildren. Everything they had worked for, everything they had built together, surrounded them in that moment. The ring on Penelope's finger caught the light from the window, gleaming gold against her weathered skin, a symbol of loss transformed into hope, of an ending that became a beginning, of a journey that led exactly where it was meant to go. The years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Isaac and Penelope grew older together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. They watched their grandchildren grow and eventually welcomed great-grandchildren into the world. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through Michael and his sons, a lasting legacy of Isaac's hard work and vision. Penelope never stopped wearing her mother's ring. It was a constant presence on her finger, a reminder of where she had come from and how far she had traveled. When she was very old, sitting in the same parlor where Isaac had first kissed her all those decades ago, she would turn the ring on her finger and remember the frightened young woman who had pawned it in Philadelphia, never imagining it would lead her to a love that spanned a lifetime. Isaac remained devoted until his last breath, still telling Penelope he loved her every single day, still looking at her with the same warmth he had shown that first afternoon in the schoolhouse. They had built something beautiful together, a family and a life that stretched across generations, all because a kind man had taken the time to return a lost ring to its rightful owner. In the end, It was exactly as Isaac had said that first day. Fate had brought them together, using a gold ring as its instrument. What had seemed like a terrible loss, pawning her mother's most precious possession, had actually been the first step on a journey to everything Penelope had ever wanted. The ring that represented her past had opened the door to her future, connecting her to a man who would love her faithfully for more than 50 years, and give her a family that would carry their love forward long after they were gone. When Penelope was 83 years old, she called Elizabeth to her bedside and pressed the ring into her daughter's hand. "This brought your father and me together," she said, her voice weak but clear. "It has magic in it, I think. Real magic. Keep it safe. Pass it down. Make sure the story is never forgotten." Elizabeth promised, tears streaming down her face. She kept that promise, telling her own children and grandchildren about the ring and the love story it represented. The ring became a family treasure, passed down through the generations, carrying with it the tale of a young woman's courage, a good man's kindness, and the love that grew from a chance encounter in a dusty mining town at the edge of the world. Isaac and Penelope were buried side by side on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under the vast blue sky they had both loved. Their graves were marked with simple stones bearing their names and the dates of their lives, along with a single inscription that captured everything they meant to each other. It read simply, "Together always." And they were together, always, in the memories of their descendants, in the land they had tamed and loved, and in the story of the ring that had brought them together and changed both their lives forever. It was a love story born of hardship and chance, nurtured through years of work and dedication, and ultimately triumphant in its simple, profound truth. Two lonely people had found each other in the wilderness of the American West, and together they had built a love that would echo through generations, a testament to kindness, providence, and the enduring power of the human heart.